it's been so long since we've done a hearing. Okay, let's start just for the record for the radio audience. This is an oversight hearing. This is the Assembly Budget Subcommittee number 5 on Public Safety. I am Gilbert Cedillo, Chair. I am joined by my colleague, Luis Alejo, fine representative from Watsonville, the home of that incredible apple juice. We're not here to talk about that. We will have other guests come in. Other members are interested, and we are ready to begin. So let's start with number 1, issue number 2. Who's speaking on the update on our $380 million augmentation that was intended to address structural imbalances in the last year's budget? So the issue before us today is the institution expenditures and the requirement that we put forth last year that was going to be tell us how the expenditures are tracking compared to the approved allotment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Justin Howard from the Department of Finance. Last year, the legislature approved a $380 million augmentation for the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation in order to cover a specific structural shortfall in their adult institutions budget. In addition to that language, at the same time, the administration put forth some reporting language that required the department to report back on institution expenditures periodically throughout the year. While we have not submitted any of those initial reports at this time, we are trying to make some progress in that area. I do want to point out that within the department this year, there are a lot of changes that are going on in general with the implementation of AB 109 and realignment. Staff within the department, as well as the control agencies that review and support the department, have been busy at work trying to downsize the department in an effort to achieve the full savings related to AB 109, which, as you know, in the governor's budget is proposed to be approximately $1.1 billion in the budget year, growing to approximately $1.65 billion in 14-15. And with that, I will turn it over to Scott Carney from the Department of Corrections to kind of give you an update on where the department stands with some of this work.
You want to go? Before we go further, though, let's talk about, so what are you doing to get the report? We missed the first one. One's due tomorrow. Who's assigned to it? What's the benchmarks that are created? I know there's a big mass change taking place. You articulated that well, but specifically, you know, we all have these challenges in our offices. We've got more things to do than we have people, but someone needs to be in charge of this. Someone needs to have a benchmark, a due date, an outline of when we can expect that report. I know that this is as you said, a $1.5 billion endeavor that we're trying to engage in, but you know, $380 million is not necessarily chump change, as they would say. At least it merits a report.
Absolutely, sir. Good afternoon. Scott Carney, Director of Administrative Services for the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. We are working on that report. That report will not be submitted by the due date tomorrow, but we are doing our best to get that out as soon as possible.
Who's doing that?
Pardon me?
Who's we?
The department. So I've got administrative services. I'm accompanied today by the deputy director for our budget management branch, John Wordlaw. We're working together with our partners in the Division of Adult Institutions to put together that report. That report will be based on our expenditures to date.
How many people you have working on that?
We have our program support unit team working with all of the institution budget analysts, along with the 75 people in our budget management branch who are doing our departmental projections.
Who's the point person?
The budget management branch is under my purview, and I've got the Division of Administrative Services, sir, and we do the report card for the department on the budget.
And I think it's important to note, too, that the budget unit in and of itself has had significant vacancies at the beginning of the year. They're running about 50% vacancy rate within that unit right now. Also, Scott and John Wardlow are new to the department. They were not on board initially at the time that the Budget Act was passed, and so it's taken some time to get them up to speed and to get their budget shop up to speed.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
How long is that report? How many pages?
The report is not written yet. The report will provide a summary of our monthly budget plan process and projections. So it'll take the year-to-date expenditures. At this point, we'll be through the first 6 months of the year with projections for the remainder of the year. We absolutely appreciate the urgency, and we will get that report and provide that to the committee and to your staff.
But I think we heard that story before. I mean, from the enactment of the legislation, it required the first report to be within 75 days. That was on September 13th, and that didn't happen. And then when that deadline came around and there was no report, we heard the same excuse. And here we are now 6 months later. The next report is due tomorrow, and you're also telling us that that is not ready. And from what I hear, it's a very short report, about 3 pages long. It's not very extensive. So here last year, you were requesting supplemental funding, and so I find it hard that to justify you taking the $380 million with this very small request to report back within a reasonable timeline, 75 days, and now 6 months on top of that. And you're coming back and still saying you're not going to meet the report deadline of tomorrow, and you can't give us a definite date when that report's going to come in, when it's not a very extensive report about how that money has been spent over those last few months that I just talked about.
Well, I apologize if we've left any misimpression about the complexity of the report. I absolutely understand your frustration. We acknowledge the importance of this, and we're committed to getting it done. The summary information, which may be in brief, will have extensive detail behind it, and the bulk of what we're doing is folding in that $380 million that was provided for 11-12 to reflect the imbalance between our real cost of doing business and the budget as it had existed, and the fact that the legislature and the governor worked together to address that and appropriate funds for the real cost of doing business at CDCR is something that makes a significant difference, and we owe a report back on that. At the same time, we are developing our plans to implement and have implemented our workforce cap reduction, to do the first year of realignment and the $453 million that goes along with that. And that, sir, really is where the if it was status quo and we were taking year-to-date expenditures and there wasn't a fundamental restructuring of how we do business, doing the projections for the remainder of the year should be pretty straightforward. But given the amount of change that's going on, that's really the issue that complicates the analysis and is what is taking the time. We have to build those in. We have developed the implementation plans for those other significant reductions. Reducing the population reduces our staffing needs, which reduces the dollar requirement. And as we have developed those operational plans, we have a plan that we can manage to. And then we are working with our statewide institutions to roll out those projections. What I can tell you today is 2 things. We've got a new level of planning and management that is helping us make sure that we will live within the budget as a department. At the same time, we do know that, as was acknowledged in the structural deficit funding, that the funding for the institutions did not reflect the real cost of doing business. And we continue to do complex analytical work on our reduction plans, but also looking at the real cost of doing business to identify what the funding need is. We will be able to accommodate that within the department this year in terms of the overall budget. We are not projecting a deficiency at this time. It will likely result in the need, and this is what we're working on identifying, to move some surpluses from other areas of the department to fund costs in the institutions. Now, what we're doing is trying to make sure that we're only funding those real legitimate costs, that we are managing to the expected decline in population, which will lead to reduced staff, it will lead to reduced overtime, it will lead to reduced expenditures for inmate-related expenses, and we're trying to manage to that target. At the same time, we've got other areas where we know we have costs that we need to account for. So one of the things that we've identified this year is in working with our program partners in the Division of Adult Institution, we've seen some increases in leave usage, sick leave. We're trying to understand, and we have to do that work working with the operational partners to say, what is the explanation of that? How do we plan for that? At the same time, we spend significant resources on transporting inmates. We're currently seeing spikes in auto fuel and those kinds of things. So we're trying to...
Why not in your reports address those rather than giving nothing to the legislature, to have given this interim report in September reflecting where you're at that point in time, and then for March 1st to be able to give us an updated report, but not giving anything, and you're the person who's overseeing all this, to not come back here and say we're not going to meet the deadline tomorrow either. I think according to what we see, this was a reasonable time frame for you to be able to provide those reports, and that's all we're asking for. It's not unreasonable within that amount of time, almost 8-9 months, and to not give us anything in writing. I think it's disappointing, but certainly you're here now, and you could give us a time frame. When do you expect that report to be submitted to us?
We are finishing our calculations now, and we're doing our best to get that to you very soon.
So what's the time frame? When can we get it? Because that's what we heard before. By when? How long? Within 2 weeks? When are we going to get it?
I do not have a date for you, sir. We are doing our best to finish our calculations and get that to you as soon as possible.
I find that unacceptable, because that's what you said last September, and 6 months later you haven't got it to us yet. So I think we need a more definite time frame within 30 days, no longer 30 days to get that to us. This has gone over, and certainly we've been noticing, what CDCR has done, redirecting funds away from inmate educational, vocational programs to balance out the budget. But we need to have those reports so we could see how this money is being spent. And if you're not turning anything into us, we're not getting the information that we've asked from you.
Absolutely, and you're correct, sir. That has been the historical practice. We will do our best to get you that report. The other commitment that I will make is, unlike years past where we have reported the year-end shuffling of money or moving to address our real costs in certain areas, at a point when the legislature couldn't consider that for future budgets, we are also, in addition to getting the report done, we're also moving whatever movement we need to do to address our real cost up, and trying to manage to a deadline so that we can share that and actively engage with the legislature by the time of the May revision, rather than continuing what was past practice of reporting to you after the fact when we can't have a conversation about what the budget or future budgets will look like. So we're also working to make that procedural change as well.
Well, it's going to be hard talking about this upcoming budget to continue to appropriate additional funding when you're not complying with what you're supposed to. It makes it difficult justifying continuing to give additional funding when we're taking funding from many other critical programs that the people of California expect. We're having them all make tough decisions, and when we put this in budget language, it's not optional. It's not whenever I could get it to you. There's certain deadlines that should be met, and you should be doing everything possible to comply with that language that was put as part of our augmentation to you.
I see Assemblywoman Nancy Skinner's joined us, and she'll be joining us up at the dais, but I want you to give me a date. It's in your hands. You have a sense. You are handling this. You've got to be able to give me, you know your benchmarks, you know your due diligence. There's got to be some goal that you have in your mind, in your head, that we can operate with.
Well, we need to finish our calculations and share those with our partners at finance and within the administration. I believe that
So that takes us some time.
it takes some time. What I was going to say is I will make the commitment that I think that the 30-day window that has been provided seems reasonable, and if we have a difficulty in that, I will let you know sooner rather than later and communicate that via the staff.
So we're looking at, what's 30 days from today? Who's got their iPad out?
March 31st? March 30th?
We're generous. Okay, so we're looking at March 29th.
I will let, and if there's any problems, I'll let you know sooner rather than later, sir.
Mr. Fuhrer?
Sounds like we've sort of wound up this part of the discussion, but as you all know, my office called seeking more information about this report and the lack of timing today before the meeting. And I guess the only thing I would add, I wanted to just say a word because I want to be sure that it's clear that the views reflected by our chair and by Mr. Alejo are widely shared, I'm sure, by every member of the committee. We're at a time now where oversight of state departments has never been more important. And the failure to receive timely reports disables us from being effective overseers of one of the most expensive operations in state government. Our constituents are demanding levels of efficiency that we've never seen before, agreeing that people want everything at once. They want top quality services, they want the safest streets possible in this case, and at the same time they want to do it for very little money. We, as a legislature this year, and it is not unique to this department, are going to be riveted on the receipt of timely information to enable us to perform our job as overseers more effectively than we've ever done. So what you're hearing, I think, from all of us is how utterly unacceptable the continuing flouting of legislative directives is in this area. I'm not going to belabor the point. It's already been made clear. I thought it was important that each of us add our voice to this, so there's no question this is not a unique concern from two of our strongest members. It's a concern of all of us.
Yes, Assemblywoman Skinner.
I want to thank first the chair, Assemblymember Cedillo, for holding this oversight hearing. And I join it not as a member of this budget subcommittee, but as a member of the Assembly Public Safety Committee, and also as a participant for the last, I don't know if I've been in it through 2 or 3 years, but anyway, the Budget Conference Committee. And I was very upset to see that the department had not yet submitted the report and still could not give us a date for the report. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One, there were many of us who did not want to adopt a budget that increased the allocation to the department. And that is not because we don't feel that the department serves, obviously, an extraordinarily important purpose within the state. But at a point where we, and I know other members have spoken to this, but at a point where we were eliminating adult day health care, cutting back on child care, basically at the lowest funding of our K through 12 schools of any state in the nation, that we would at that same time, I mean, I don't think there was anything that survived a cut, and yet we increased the allocation to the department, to the CDCR. Now, we increased that allocation also at the same time where we held up legislation such as the limitation on time ads, the guards using time ads as a punitive measure in the juvenile justice program, because we were told that the department was going to do it administratively. So these were discussions in the Budget Conference Committee where we were assured that the department would move forward on that elimination of time ads so that we could score the type of savings that we were scoring in the budget. They would move forward on the types of population reductions that had been addressed through a variety of different policies, and would also not cut the rehabilitative services, because that was a focus in the Senate and the Assembly, and doing the reconciliation that we do as part of the conference committee. The Assembly was very, very concerned that we not be in a position of achieving savings through further cuts of rehab services, especially when we were increasing the budget. So now we see that the rehab services have continued to be cut. And we have seen that the department has redirected funding in order to free up funding in effect for other programs by, again, reducing the rehab programs. That we don't see the kind of savings from any impact on the time ads. And because we don't have the report, we can't, I could sit here and be more critical, but I don't want to be randomly critical, but I don't have any document for me to measure for, in terms of, what we directed and then what is being achieved right now. So I'm frustrated, and certainly it's very difficult to go back to our districts and talk to our constituents about the kind of cuts we're making, and then to tell them, yes, but meanwhile, we're increasing the budget for CDCR at the same time that we're supposedly decreasing the population of CDCR, or that we're redirecting the services under realignment. And certainly the services within the counties and the cities is not reflected. In other words, that movement of that population is not reflected in a CDCR budget. That's a completely different budget. So how we could be doing that at the same time that we're increasing the department's budget is really, really hard to justify. And we need better. We need more, and we need better.
And would absolutely agree with you, and I acknowledge the frustration. I think it's important to note that for the department, the total department budget is decreasing. So the department is additional...
The budget that we adopted in June of 2011, it did not.
Additional funding was provided for the institutions to reflect such things as the fact that rather than having correctional staff who are on average low seniority, high seniority, middle of the road, middle pay folks, that we actually had a large percentage of folks who had been with the state for a long time and were senior, and the real cost on a per position basis on average was higher. And there was an augmentation provided to the institutions.
We were truing up. We were being honest with our adoption, right? But we were being honest in that adoption at the same time that we enacted policies within those trailer bills that directed certain changes in administration of the department and other activity that should have shown us big savings. So we agreed to true up and be honest because we also expected then to see.
Right, and the department budget is going from $9.7 billion to $8.9 billion over 2 years, and we are seeing the real result of the legislation that was passed and enacted, and it is changing our operations, and that's where...
But now, is that $1 billion reduction primarily from the shift to the localities, or is it reflect any of the other directions that we've given? Because we already know what kind of reductions you should automatically assume due to the shift to the localities. But the other internal activity is what we need to see from you.
No, I appreciate that. Much of the prior reductions in the previous years did not have any direct result on the reduction in CDCR's inmate population. The fact of the matter is much of the legislation that will ultimately end up getting passed was either watered down to the point that it wasn't able to achieve the necessary savings that would always get scored. And in essence, what would end up happening within CDCR's budget is they would have to do with massive unallocated reductions, for which we then tried to come back next year and say, we need to fund the true cost of this program, and we need to enact legislation that actually has a material impact on the population so that we can achieve the savings on an ongoing basis.
So my apologies, because I don't tend to interrupt DeVar and staff when they're speaking, and it's not my tendency, but I suppose I have a heightened frustration on this. And part of the reason, sometimes legislation is required. Sometimes we have to do things legislatively, but other times we don't. We don't have to legislate certain practices of the department. And in various times, various of these, like the time ads, like the medical parole and various other things, even though we ended up doing the legislation on the medical parole, but we were assured by the department in budget committees, in conference committee, in public safety, that many of these things could be achieved without specific legislation, just through directives of the department. And so to turn back and say that it wasn't done because either the legislation was too watered down, it's just not adequate.
Well, we'll definitely go back and check on the time ads. It's a DJJ issue that I'm not necessarily familiar with. This is considering the augmentation we were seeking last year was for the adult institutions. Medical parole, the prior administration obviously thought it was important to have some legislation behind that. I know that this administration is actually looking again at medical parole to see if there's anything more we can do beyond what we're currently doing. We are definitely interested in pursuing further review of that program to see if there's any more that we can get out of it.
Mr. Chair, thank you for joining us. Welcome you.
Thank you very much, and just to indulge me for a moment, I'm trying to stop in. We have over 60 subcommittee hearings between, leading up to the May revise, and I'm trying to stop in on as many as I can, and I'm following them all closely, and obviously working with you and the other chairs on all of these. I wanted to, I'm going to have to run in a minute, but I wanted to stop down on at this one, at least at the beginning, to reiterate how important it is that we receive the CDCR spending data. The spending accountability was a very big issue in conference committee last year, and it's been an ongoing discussion in our caucus. I was disappointed when we didn't get the first report, and I'm really expecting, and I know that the chair of the committee is really expecting, that we get the second report in a timely manner. So I wanted to come down personally to make that point, and just also reiterate my support for the great work that the chair is doing and that this committee is doing in parsing through these issues, and thank also Assemblywoman Skinner for joining in on this issue that she's passionate about and that we're working through as a subcommittee. And I'll be following closely and working closely with the chair as we move forward. But I wanted to at least get down to make that point. And thank you very much. And please know we're eagerly awaiting that report.
I think I want you to appreciate the bipartisan nature of our concerns about the failure to have numbers to evaluate where we're at. Assemblymember Harkey, you may want to chime in on the other side of the aisle.
I had a meeting with Mr. Kelso probably a couple months ago, and he had indicated to me that under the new governor there's some changes being made, but that he expected the staff would decrease at the CDCR over the next year. It didn't happen immediately because of some reason. I think it was just a matter of implementing one policy at the local level, but that he had expected fully that there would be a staff decrease of, and I think he said about 1,000 people, and that we would save. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but I do recall him saying we would save $1 billion out of CDCR. So I just wanted to add that. I heard Ms. Skinner asking some questions, and that came from Mr. Kelso in my office, that he's wrapping up his work and expects that will be the state savings, not necessarily that will accrue at the local level, but we should, because of the realignment, see that. Thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
So I just want to clarify, Mr. Parney, that the report is due tomorrow, March 1st, so really the goal should not be 30 days, should be immediately to get that report at the earliest possible time, and that's what we're stressing. We're not giving no 30-day extension. We expect the report in immediately.
Understood.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's go to issue 1 and get a prison population trends, LAO.
Drew Soderborg, Legislative Analyst's Office. Your staff has asked us to discuss some of the history behind the increase in the prison population. If you turn to page 3 of your agenda, you'll see a figure depicting the prison population from 1980 up to the present time. As you can see in that chart, beginning in the early 1980s and continuing through much of the 1990s, the prison population began to increase rapidly until it reached its first peak of about 161,000 inmates in 1999, followed by a handful of years of decline. After that point, it began rising again until reaching a peak of over 170,000 in 2006. Since 2006, however, the prison population has been in decline. The 2011-12 population is expected to continue this trend and is expected to reach about 150,000, which is about 8% lower than the previous year's population. And CDCR currently projects that the prison population will reach about 124,000 by 2016-17, which is about a 24% decline relative to the 2010-11 number. There's obviously numerous factors at play here that account for the increase in the prison population. Obviously, crime is one of them. The property and violent crime rate increased rapidly beginning in the 1960s, with the property crime rate peaking in the early 1980s and the violent crime rate peaking in the early 1990s. Since then, however, crime has largely been in decline. Another important factor was a combination of the passage of the Uniform Determinate Sentencing Law in 1976 and the general increase in the amount in the length of determinate sentences after that point. So following the passage of the 1976 law, individuals were sentenced to set terms rather than getting indeterminate sentences where they'd be released by the parole board. And after that point, generally sentences were largely increased. In addition, in 1994, the Three Strikes Law was passed, which gave life sentences to certain qualifying felons and increased the lengths of sentences for other individuals who had prior felony convictions, as well as eliminating their ability to earn sentence credits. In terms of the factors that have driven the decrease in the population, the blip in the prison population that you see following 1999, the decrease there has generally been attributed to the passage of Prop 36, which allowed certain individuals convicted of nonviolent drug possession crimes to get drug treatment or probation sentences in lieu of jail or prison. Also in 2009, a series of trailer bills were passed that authorized non-revocable parole for nonviolent, non-serious, non-sex offenders. This legislation also increased sentence credits and increased the dollar threshold for property crimes. All those generally drove the prison population down. In 2010, SB 678 was passed, which gave counties an incentive to keep adult felony probationers out of state prison. That generally resulted in a decrease in the population. And of course, last year's realignment legislation also significantly decreased the population. I'd be happy to answer any questions about that, or I could move on to the discussion about the federal court order to reduce prison overcrowding.
Yes.
I just want to ask a couple questions about this, because there are key policy implications that arise from our properly attributing certain steps to a diminution in prison population. And so it's really important to get it right, because our foremost obligation is public safety. Now, the rate, one can say certainly that realignment is going to result in a diminution in state prison population. But there was a diminution in state prison population happening in advance of realignment, just not at a pace fast enough for us to contend with the costs associated with the prison population we have. To what do you attribute that pre-realignment reduction? You said Prop 36, but Prop 36 is, among most practitioners, roundly considered to be not very successful. There's no money there, and so forth. What is it that is driving down, in a pre-realignment context, the prison population? Because, see, what's interesting is the continued, if you look at another curve that isn't reflected in your chart, there's been a continued decline in crime as well. It would seem counterintuitive. If you're saying, let me be really clear about this, if you are properly attributing a decrease in crime to determinate sentencing and 3 strikes, to laws that remain in place, and at the moment crime is going down even as prison population is declining, there's something we're not analyzing properly. So you want to respond to that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. I want to be careful to note that we definitely we're not attributing the drop in crime to the passage of 3 strikes or determinate sentencing.
You're an increase in prison population.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
The bottom line, the prison population is declining as crime is declining.
That's correct.
So the argument that simply overpopulating our prisons is keeping us disproportionately safe is obviously not entirely true. We're seeing a diminution in both lines. So what's going on?
One of the factors that caused the decrease in the population prior to realignment goes back again to that trailer bill legislation that I mentioned that was passed in 2009, where certain people were made ineligible to be revoked back to prison. There was also an increase in the amount of sentencing credits granted.
But again, these are items to which to attribute the diminution in prison population.
That's correct.
But crime is continuing to decline even as former prison inmates are supervised in the community.
That's correct.
And so, do you know anything about rates of recidivism among those who are in that universe?
We don't have great data on the rates of recidivism for offenders who are supervised locally rather than offenders who are supervised by the state. Historically, the state's recidivism rate, though, has been around 68 or 70%. Right. But we don't have similar numbers for the recidivism rate of individuals supervised by counties.
Yeah, I don't wish to belabor the point in a hearing that's going to last for a long time, but another sort of there are things that are counterintuitive about all this. Fewer people in prison, rehab hardly existing in prison, people being released from prison and supervised locally, and all the while crime declining at the same time. And the thing is, I cannot sit here and say I know enough about California's demographic data, but I think one of the most accurate predictors of criminal activity is age, particularly among people who have been in prison previously. But California's population is not necessarily aging rapidly during this time frame. I mention these things, and I'm going to stop now because I think that your analysis, our collective analysis of how all these factors come together, has a great deal to do with the policies we adopt moving forward. Maybe I should say one more thing. For example, one of the critiques of realignment has been, as you supervise more former inmates locally, there will be an increase in crime. That was a prediction made by opponents of realignment. It is not a prediction borne out, according to your statistics, from our initial forays into more local supervision. The example given was non-revocable parole. And I think we're going to need some real help from you, beyond just housing people, predicting behavior, discussing the role that rehab plays or doesn't play, and what we should be doing next. Really important stuff for us.
If I could add to the conversation here for a minute, I think one thing that has helped over time, I'm not saying that this is the sole answer to your question, but one thing that has definitely helped has been the expansion of the risk and needs assessments by the counties and the implementation of various programs within probation itself to deal with counties at the local level. What we have seen from SB 678 and initially the Burn JAG grant funding that was funneled down through to the counties to get that program started is they were able to put into place many targeted programs for specific people who are on their caseloads, and that has only expanded as the state has made good on its commitment to share the savings of that program with the probation departments. So they have been putting more people who historically would have been coming to prison into programs at the local level.
Well, the implication of which is, if as realignment moves forward, we sure as heck better be sure that there is accompanying funding for the purpose of assuring those services remain in place for supervised former inmates.
That is correct. So part of the realignment funding and the way that the model worked provided resources to deal with the same population. So instead of waiting for the state savings to generate and then provide half of it in arrears to probation, realignment, in other words, is now pre-funding this population and the programs for the population. And the counties need to continue to fund those successful programs that probation has already started.
Now, the other point is we need, as a legislature, to be adopting smart policies that make our communities safer, irrespective of what might be the narrative that previously existed about a certain law leading to a result. We should know what the data shows as a matter of science, because that's what would best drive our decision making.
Assemblymember, yes, sir.
I don't know if you're going to cover this in your other points, but just if you get the plan for dealing with female inmates, there's some significant changes in dealing with that prison population and what's going to happen with the future of Valley State Prison. But what's our state's plan dealing with that transition?
Right now, the administration's plan for Valley State Prison is that it would be converted to a male facility by July 2013. The other policy initiative related to female inmates that the governor is proposing is alternative custody for women. This is a program that had already been in place, but it was restricted to individuals who didn't have a current or prior serious or violent or sex offense. Because of the effects of realignment, that obviously is going to end up screening out most of the women following realignment, and so the administration is proposing to expand that to all offenders regardless of their history of offense. But the other qualifiers would remain in place.
All female inmates.
That's correct.
And how many is that?
Well, to clarify, it wouldn't expand to all female inmates. It would expand to just all female inmates who have a current conviction of it that is non-serious, non-violent. The current legislation, which was an assembly bill passed prior, restricted the program just to people who are non-serious and non-violent. You could not participate if you had a prior serious or violent conviction. So what we're proposing is to remove that restriction to allow more women to participate in this program. What we found when you look at the prison population, just in general, over 70% of the women currently in state prison are low risk to commit violence, and that many of these people need treatment and they need to be in programs in order to help reintegrate them back into society because they've either been in bad relationships or have had substance abuse problems. And so the administration, what we want to do is ensure that we have an ongoing pipeline for this program so that we can effectively treat these women. And what we plan to do is use savings that is generated within the institutions from not housing them in the institutions to then go out and find programs in the community in which we can place these offenders.
So how many female prisoners are there now, and how many will, after enacting this program?
So I'm Darby Kernan. I'm with the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. I want to just clarify, it was Senate Bill 1266 that created the first alternative custody program. It's a voluntary program, so women have to volunteer to participate in it. And then there's a social worker that has to create an individual treatment plan, and there's a lot of work that goes into it. Currently, we have 33 women who have been placed on alternative custody. 2 have paroled already, and only one person has violated their terms and have been returned to custody. We have 78 women who have been approved at this point, and we're going through the creation of the independent treatment plan, individual treatment plan for those individuals, and verifying their housing and everything, because there's no funding attached currently to the alternative custody program. So there's no bed for them in the community. They have to go return to a family member, or somebody has to volunteer to put them up. And so that has been one of the biggest challenges of actually implementing this program.
But again, how many prisoners system-wide are there still at Valley State Prison? What's the overall number?
Oh, female offenders. Nobody has been removed from Valley State Prison. No female offenders have been removed. Our female prison population has dropped the quickest. And I want to say, prior to implementation of realignment, it was almost 10,000, and it's right at 7,000 now for all 3 of our female prisons. Our conversion of Valley State Prison to a male facility, no female offenders will be moved out of there until after September of this year. We are currently working through litigation with the city and county on that issue.
So I'm trying to understand where we're at now after you implement the alternative custody program for those that qualify. how many are not going to be eligible, and what's the plan for those female inmates?
So, good question. Of the remaining population, upon full implementation of realignment, we expect the remaining female population to hover somewhere between 5,000 and 5,500 females. Of that population, we expect roughly about 1,000 or so to even meet the eligibility requirements, assuming we get the requested change in statute that we are asking for.
So what's the plan for the rest?
So the plan for the rest is to continue with gender-responsive programming within the institutions.
Valley State Prison. At Valley State Prison or where else?
No, at the remaining two women's facilities.
And we have a new associate director over the female offender program who's really looking at, for the first time, we can go in and do a lot with the women offenders. And so kind of looking at it as a smaller prison system, how can we better improve the programs that we're providing to the female offenders? And so we're working on that right now.
I think I'm going to ask just if there's a public comment on just this specific point on the, yes, after we hear from you. But I think I'm going to ask for public comment just on this matter. So the number on alternative custody program was around, you're targeting 100? You said you had 30-something and then maybe 70-something?
Okay.
If we get the proposed request change in law that we are asking for, we are expecting to try to maintain somewhere between 200 to 300 average daily population out on alternative custody upon full implementation. It would be more than that in terms of the number of women rolling through the program, because currently you're targeting those women who are becoming close to their release date. Typically, the last 4 to 5 months of their sentence would be put into this program.
And on the question of, I heard you talk about the savings, or that the savings do not follow them, so you're not being able to take advantage of savings for programming for them?
So currently, when 1266 was passed, there was no funding associated with it. So the alternative custody program, which we've developed and implemented, we don't have funding to get contract beds to put women in programs outside of prison. And so what we've been doing is we've been building up resources in the communities where women can get treatment for free, basically, but they also are living with their families and returning to their homes. And so that becomes a process that slows things down. The governor's proposal attaches the savings from women coming out of those prison beds and connects it so that they can move forward and get contracts and put them in programs outside of prison.
Because if we're no longer spending the
Right.
$25,000 on them in the prison, we can then turn around and pump that into a community-based program in which to help these women.
I do want to just say that public safety is Secretary Kate's #1 priority with this. And so while 33 people being out in the community seems very small, we've gone through a very diligent and detailed process to set this program up, and I think that is really what we want to make sure, is that the people who are getting out are the right people and that they're getting the services they need.
Okay. Can we take public comment on this now?
Thank you. My name's Stephen Downing. I'm a retired deputy chief from the Los Angeles Police Department. I'm also a board member of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, an organization of about 50,000 supporting membership of close to 4,000 criminal justice professionals who oppose the war on drugs. I provided my full testimony expecting a different agenda today, but it didn't work out, so I've cut it way down. And if I may, I'd just like to say the prohibitionist policies of this country have destroyed generations of our young people.
Excuse me, I don't want to cut you off, and I'll stay here to take your testimony, but I was asking for public comment on this specific matter related to the women's population.
On prison population?
Women.
Women, no.
All right. I will not cut you off, but it's just not, it's not timely. Yes.
Helen Roth Dowden from SEIU Local 1000. We represent the workers in the women's prisons. and we're supportive of the 1266 when it went through. But want to let you know that for those women who are left in prison, because they have the lowest possibility of recidivating, coming back in, what happened is they received, when the rehabilitation budgets were cut, their budget for rehabilitations were cut the most. So 70% of the academic and the vocational programs in the women's prisons were cut, which means the women who are waiting to get out are not receiving these services, which would make them have the ability to support their families when they get out. So there's $100 million that's been put back in the budget. We would like to make sure that some of this goes back to restoring some of those programs for the women, particularly the vocational education programs, which were cut so greatly. Thank you.
Greetings. My name is Emily Harris, and I'm the statewide coordinator for CURB, which is Californians United for a Responsible Budget. And we have a series of member organizations across the state working to reduce the number of people in prison and the number of prisons in the state. And we put together a series of written testimony for you all, but specifically on the alternative custody program. There's two pieces. One around removing barriers for people to originally we'd heard 4,000 people could be eligible, and only 33 have been released so far. So we have documented some ways in which those barriers could be removed. And then we also have a proposal from one of our board members who's a lifer at the California Institution for Women, proposing an expansion of the alternative custody program for elderly prisoners. And then there'll be more in the packet that'll go towards different points in the agenda today, but I just wanted to bring your attention to that, and a few of our members are here to highlight a little bit more of the details. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Karen Shane, and I'm with Legal Services for Prisoners with Children. And mainly I want to talk about some of the disappointments we have felt with the implementation of the alternative custody program, because it was the one thing that came out of last year's legislation that really talked about releasing people rather than moving people from one spot to another. And the fact that there has been so little movement, that 33 women, I'm sure it's for the 32 that are still out, it's a major improvement. But whatever the number is, I think the last figure we had was that possibly 500 women would qualify for this program, and the fact that it's still only at 33 is a source of disappointment, and it makes me wonder what it will mean to expand the number of people that are eligible for it. And of course, I'm very in favor of expanding that number, but without actually implementing it, it's very hard to see what where that's really going to go. So I think it has potential, but it's far from having been able to see that potential. The other thing that I do think is important is to remember what is happening to the women who are being left behind in this situation, and that there, no whatever number you use, whether it's 500, 1,000, whatever, we're still talking about somewhere around 5,000 to 5,500 women who will still be in the state prison after all of these programs are implemented. And for those women, and I've spent a great deal of time with them, they're very concerned about the fact that there has been so little programming, and whatever programming has happened has been cut so drastically. So again, I just want to emphasize that that maintaining programming and developing programming for people who are going to be staying in the state prison system has to be a priority for the department. And then finally, I was just looking at the LAO report while I was waiting for the hearing to begin, and I did want to mention the issue around older prisoners. And while of course this is about older male prisoners as well as older female prisoners, we did a report several years ago, and I have one copy, and I'd be happy to leave it with you. It's called "Dignity Denied: The Price of Imprisoning Older Women in California." And a lot of the issues that are raised in that report are also actually in the LAO report, and I wanted to just read out a couple of sentences out on page 29. Most notably, it appears that the post-realignment inmate and parolee population will have a relatively higher proportion of inmates who have a lower risk to reoffend, as well as a relatively lower proportion of inmates who have a high risk to offend. This is likely because the inmates and parolees remaining after realignment will be relatively older because they are serving longer sentences because of their current or prior violent and serious crimes. Research indicates that the risk of reoffending decreases significantly with age. And so, again, there is this report that was put out by one of the board members of CURB, Californians United for a Responsible Budget, to really look at older prisoners. And let's try to figure out a way to bring them out of the prison. They're by far the most expensive to house and by far the least likely to be reoffending and to creating problems out here. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sam McEwen-Page. I'm with Justice Now, and we're the only organizations that is going inside prison and getting testimonies from the people who are experiencing this most directly. And I just want to encourage to look at the submitted comments that we have and testimonies from people inside that speak to the ways that the vagueness in the language and the barriers to access to the alternative custody program are so extensive that hundreds and thousands of women are wanting to apply and are supposedly eligible, but there are reasons why the vagueness in the language is keeping that from happening. And so I want to encourage the committee to expand or lift the barriers and also expand the program to people in men's prisons as well. And also talking about the VSPW closure, I was just inside CCWP last week, and many of the women in there are really concerned because due to the budget cuts, the mental health and medical has been severely impacted inside, and they're very concerned with what might happen if VSPW is closed before all of the proposed women and the population is decreased, and that the population inside VSPW will increase and further impact the reasons why this is happening in the first place. So thank you.
Two more.
Hi, my name is Matt Kelliger. I'm also with Justice Now. I want to reiterate that point about VSPW's conversion from a women's facility into a men's facility as causing a tremendous amount of trepidation for us as an organization, but also for our constituency, which is almost totally in prison. So a big concern is that women in prison, as you probably already know, since we have to focus with such a microscope on it, are already highly marginalized. And there are these reports of 8 women in a cell for 4, and there's this concern that 10 women are going to be in a cell for 4, and there's ad hoc lottery systems for elderly women to get lower bunks, and all sorts of other things that don't always get included in reports. And from where we sit in a grassroots position where we work directly with the people most affected by this, our concern is that VSPW's conversion to a men's prison is only going to escalate the overcrowding conditions and the health concerns that follow overcrowding that led to the plot of litigation. We really want to encourage the council to, the committee to, view that with a high level of scrutiny. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Hafsa Alami, and I'm with California Coalition for Women Prisoners in San Francisco. We provide some legal advocacy for the women at VSPW, CIW, and Valley State Prison. And visiting the women both at Valley State Prison and California CCWF, as you've just heard, there's tremendous trepidation amongst the prisoners regarding this whole conversion issue. The women know that their numbers are going to be condensed and basically sent to CIW and CCWF. They're very concerned about it. Basically, it amounts to overcrowding of those other 2 remaining prisons. And in addition to that, and above all else, if we are lowering the number of women in the prison, it would seem to me like we should be able to close the prison altogether, as we're looking at during and after realignment, shifting of prisoners all around the state anyway. If there are extra beds and surplus beds and all of these that we've heard today and have seen in the report, it doesn't make sense to continue to try to fill all the prisons. We're supposed to be reducing our population, and that doesn't seem to be happening. I've heard a couple of statements today about there being 200 to 300 slots or spaces available for women who may be eligible for alternative sentencing programs. Well, if there are only 200 to 300, then those other, what I've heard today, majority of the 7,000 who are already incarcerated, no matter what they do, are not going to have a place to go to in terms of alternative sentencing programs. If the majority of the women are there because of violent crimes, let's say due to being in bad relationships or substance abuse or drug-related offenses, then yes, in alternative sentencing programs, perhaps they can get, and maybe from realignment money, access to the services that they need. I hear what sounds like a lot of doublespeak to me in trying to protect this system, and it's a rotten system. The system is not okay. We've read it time and time again, and just want to encourage you to consider closing some of these prisons, and it sounds like Valley State is one that could be closed. In the report, I think I read that the consideration is to house high-security prisoners, but I also read in the report that there were 2 other ways or instances where these prisoners could be, high-security prisoners could be housed. So I just think that further looking at this, further consideration of all aspects would be beneficial to us all. And I speak as a community person, I should just say, whose husband, prior to me meeting him, was a death row inmate, 1978, 77, 78. His sentence was commuted to life. When he got out, I met him. We got married. We've been married 32 years successfully. He is a positive addition to our community. He runs a supportive living program. He's the associate director at Center on Juvenile Criminal Justice in San Francisco. He was able to overcome whatever he had done because there were rehabilitative programs inside the prison while he was there. He was able to get an education while he was there. There were community services, community groups that went into the prison and helped him as he came out. And when he came out, he, again, wasn't an elderly person, but he was, and I don't consider him an exception. I consider his circumstances an exception. We can create and continue to support the circumstances that he was able to come out and be successful under. And just wanted to say that because he couldn't be here today to say it himself. Thank you.
Congratulations. You want to respond to the concern about the overcrowding, the very modest numbers on the alternative program?
Sure. I think first, let me just start off by saying
goals. What goals are there on this?
Good question. The goal is to treat women and make sure that
numeric goals. What's our?
So in the long term, the goal of the administration is to maintain a 200 to 300 ADP, which can be anywhere between 1,000 women a year on this program. As I said, the population is dropping fast, particularly within the women gender, the female gender. So what is occurring is that the non-serious, non-violent women who don't have serious or violent priors are no longer coming into the system. So we don't have the population in which to put onto the program based upon the current law, which is why we are requesting the trailer bill. In addition, I just want to point out that the trailer bill we are requesting is a placeholder only because we're going back and revising it. One of the issues that was brought up by one of the speakers was a very good point about the restrictions that kind of are placed on how fast we can get people on this program. And we were looking at trying to revise that in the trailer bill so that we can get people on the program much faster. As far as the crowding goes, when we're all done, if we maintain 200 to 300 ADP in the program, if we're down to about 5,000 women between the systems, we're not going to be crowded. Between these 2 locations, including between these 2 locations and the design capacity of the 2 remaining female facilities, CIW and CCWF, the crowding will be within where the administration feels is the appropriate level to house that, which is a significant decline from historically where we've been crowding these 3 facilities. So that we do not believe that there will be a crowding issue in the future once we get down to the stabilized level post-realignment.
I would just like to add, I do know that for the female offenders, there is a lot of fear right now about the change that's coming forward for them. We're doing a lot of outreach in the prisons to talk to the female offenders. The associate director has gone down there several times. Change is very hard, and so we're trying to respect that. Also, with regards to the alternative custody, we have to make sure that whoever we're putting out on alternative custody is getting the services they need, because just releasing people isn't going to help our recidivism problem. And so that's one reason we've built up relationships over this last year with all of the communities that these women are returning to get the programs they need. And so while it has seemed to be a slow start, we have 78 women ready to go out on top of the 33 that are already released, and they will be getting services so that they will not recidivate. And like I said, we've only had one person return, and I think that shows, because we're doing a really good job to make sure they're getting we know what they need when they get out, and that they're getting that.
But I would add, though, but even those community resources are having to do more with less, so certainly the thoughtful planning should be that as there's cost savings to the state, that some of that be allocated to contract those beds, provide those resources. It's not rocket science, No,
we completely agree.
All the models, yeah. So I just want to reemphasize that point, but certainly the points that were made about those who remain in the other two prisons, female prisons. I had an opportunity to visit. I have Soledad on the male side, Soledad and Salinas Valley Prison in my assembly district. Had a few visits there. I visited New Folsom, San Quentin in a couple weeks as well. Chad Youth Prison about a couple weeks ago. But in all of those, you look at the rehabilitative programs that are there, they're cut to the bone, almost not, very minimal. And those few that remain, it's actually a lot of them are driven by other inmates trying to create programs on their own, where they're volunteering their time, those who have been programming and trying to create programs for other inmates so that they're more successful when they get released. And some of those having some good success, but really being generated by other inmates themselves. So certainly there should be a thoughtful process and emphasis put on that in the remaining prisons, and putting some resources there to have the vocational programs, educational programs for those that are trying to program and be successful when they're released.
Definitely.
Okay. Can we move on to the fire camps? Right? And talk about how recent and projected population changes will impact our ability to staff them.
If the sergeants have passed out a copy of the LAO report, and if you turn to page 17 of that LAO report and look at figure 8, it will depict a chart showing a projected decline in the fire camp population. According to our estimates, the fire camp population might decline by as much as 38% relative to the 2010-11 levels. The reason for this is that realignment is going to remove much of the population that used to be eligible to participate in fire camps. As you can see, on figure 8 on page 17 actually depicts the criteria. I'm sorry, the chart depicting the decrease in the population is figure 9 on page 18. Most of many of the inmates that meet these criteria are actually going to a trip out of the system as the effects of realignment come into full force. And this is problematic for the state for several different reasons. First of all, it makes it harder to comply with the federal court's order to reduce prison overcrowding. This is because inmates in fire camps aren't counted towards the population cap set by the federal courts. It also increases prison costs because fire camps are quite a bit less expensive to operate than our traditional prisons, and it also increases the state's cost to fight fires. To address these problems, we recommend that the legislature direct CDCR to review its current eligibility criteria to assess whether or not they can be safely revised so that more inmates qualify for the fire camps. And we also recommend that CDCR look at various ways to increase the number of inmates that volunteer for these programs, whether that be increasing inmate pay or the sentence credits these inmates earn, and various other ways to encourage inmates to volunteer for the program.
No questions on this topic? Can we move on to out-of-state beds?
Sure.
So the administration is currently working on a master plan for the entire population within CDCR, including the beds, which would include what we plan to do with the out-of-state beds. That is currently under development within the administration. Obviously, the out-of-state beds provide a specific capacity that in the past has been useful, and whether or not we're going to need that level and that type of capacity in the future is being reevaluated. So at this time, while the budget proposes to continue out-of-state beds next year, we cannot say beyond that what the current plan is for out-of-state beds.
So on that issue, I was talking to staff here, but regarding the 9,000 inmates that are housed out of state, is there a plan to return, keep that same number? What is the plan for the 9,000
So for
inmates?
next year, the budget proposes continuing the out-of-state program in the 4 locations that were currently there. Beyond that year, there's the plan that is currently being worked on has not been finalized yet, so I'm not in a position to be able to say what the plan is beyond the budget year proposed level.
Okay, so after, what about the following year? There has to be a plan of how to deal with these 9,000 inmates.
Well, that's what I alluded to, is that we are currently working on a master planning of CDCR's entire population, meaning where are we going to house and how are we going to house them? In other words, you're going to look at your level 2 population, your level 3, 4, et cetera, and you're going to say, we're going to house this many offenders in this prison, this many offenders in this prison. What facilities need to convert? What reception centers need to go to general population type facilities, et cetera. So we're currently working on that right now. Within that piece also deals with the out-of-state bed program and what is our long-term plan for dealing with that population. Right now, the budget is only proposing to extend the program next year. Beyond that, I'm not at liberty to say what our plan is, as it hasn't been finalized yet.
Yeah, so, but what's the time frame? When do we expect?
So we're hoping to have the master planning done of the population by the May revise, so that we can provide a good estimate to everybody with how the administration feels the system should be operated within CDCR, including the appropriate staffing for operating such a system.
But with that, I just would like to add that, with the 3-judge panel and having to meet our marks, bringing offenders back that impacts our 33 institutions. And so as we're developing our plan, we have to take that into consideration, because we want to make sure we make all of our benchmarks.
Right. Our master planning is going to take into consideration all the issues that are currently going on, and this has been a long time coming for this department, is really looking at, do we have the correct mental health beds? Do we have the correct medical beds? What are the proper facilities that we need that provide the flexibility so that we can handle swings in the specialized populations in the future? So that's one thing that we're taking into consideration, including all the various lawsuits, so that we can go to the courts and we can come to the legislature and demonstrate that we believe this is the appropriate system that's going to be not only safe, but efficient and generate the savings that are needed to go forward. So we hope to have that by May revise, and that is the plan at this point. There's a lot of people who are working on this, which is taking up a lot of time in many people's shops, including within the adult institutions, within CDCR's budget shop. Finance is heavily involved in looking at this as well. I can tell you, I spend many hours of every day just on this specific issue, so we're hoping to get it to you.
If I could just add, when you passed realignment, it gave an opportunity for the department that we hadn't seen in 20 plus years. And initially, we spent all of our time just implementing realignment. It was a huge task, and it took so many different people to participate and get on into that and make it work successfully. Since then, we've started to look, and secretaries Kate's direction to us is look at what a prison system that's not overcrowded, what can we do within that system? And this, what Justin's talking about, is what we are doing. And so it's not that we are delaying things, it's just really the first 3 months of implementing realignment has been a huge task, and now we're moving on to what the correctional system will look like in the future, not overcrowded, where we can provide the services and resources that the offender should get.
Okay. I didn't hear you, though, or from the department on the impact on the fire camps.
Sure. So to begin with, we just want to make it clear that there is no impact on the fire camps this year. So for this upcoming fire season, there are no declines in the population. We have sufficient population to maintain the fire camps. We have a sufficient pipeline to maintain the fire camps. In the future, the population declines really start hitting towards mid to late 2013. That's when we'll start to see a decline. The County of LA has indicated to us that they're going to begin taking over the camps that are in that particular county, which will be a big boost. That means that instead of seeing a 33% reduction, as the LAO noted, in fire camp population, that leaves a 25% reduction because they will be putting their offenders into those camps, and we will still be maintaining, upon full implementation of realignment, roughly 2,500 state-eligible inmates. So that leaves roughly a gap based on how we're currently operating, about 1,000 inmates on an ongoing basis. And so there's a number of ways. The LAO pointed out some things that can be looked at. Obviously, we're hoping that some counties will look to us to contract for some of their longer-term offenders to put into the fire camps, as the fire camps aren't part of the three-judge panel population requirements within the 33 brick-and-mortar institutions. So we can take offenders from the county and place into those facilities.
And we have been talking to several counties who have shown interest into the camps.
How many? How many?
Oh, we have several people who are working on the camps, but I think we've had several outreach meetings with them. I think 3 or 4 of the larger counties have started to ask us about it. I think they've been also in the initial stages of implementing realignment, and so starting to move out of the implementation stage and look long-term of how we're going to implement realignment and address the local population. They're starting to ask questions. We have developed a contract and an MOU to work with the counties. We've worked with CSAC and the Sheriff's Association as well on those contracts and MOU, and are open to meeting with any of the sheriffs when they're interested to talk to us.
Okay.
The only thing I'd like to note and follow up to that with is to say that while allowing the counties to contract for space in the fire camps does help address the problem of the adequate supply of inmate firefighters, it doesn't necessarily help the state comply with the 3-judge panel order because we're not taking people out of prisons. Also, it doesn't help the state reduce its correctional costs because we're not taking, again, people out of the prisons and putting them in the fire camps. So we think that to the extent possible, we should really prioritize fire camps for state inmates. But if we're not able to fully fill those fire camps, then certainly contracting with counties makes sense.
Right. We're not suggesting, though, changing the formula of who's eligible to participate.
We're actually recommending that the legislature direct CDCR to look at the formula and assess whether it can be safely changed to increase the number of people who can participate.
Mr. Few? Mr. Leho? Okay. I'm going to wrap up. Mr. Leho, did you talk in your discussion, I know I stepped out on the overall plan, about the status of the unconventional beds?
Sure. So, in fact, very shortly, the CDCR will be bringing down the very last of what we call non-traditional beds. Those are beds where inmates are typically housed in either bunked in gyms and or day rooms. We were down to 3 locations, but
they're all gone. There'll be a press conference tomorrow at DVI announcing
where the last ones are coming down.
Right.
So. But so in essence, realignment has, eliminated that need, and now we're in the process of, making sure that the gyms are available for inmates so that they can program in them and, do the things that they were intended for when they were first put there.
Great. Good. That's it. I think last we want to just find out where we are on our targeted savings,
Sure, and that's kind of a little bit of what I was alluding to earlier about when I talked about master planning all of CDCR's population. Along with that master planning, their population comes the savings aspect with it, because it's tied closely to how are you going to staff the institutions in the future. Not only make sure you have sufficient staff based on what's left. One important thing that we're looking at as we reduce the population in the institutions, what's becoming clear is that we're getting very close to basically base level staffing, and it's getting harder and harder to reduce staff, because otherwise you start jeopardizing the safety of not only the staff but then inmates, because you don't have enough security around. So we're going back and we're looking prison by prison, what is the appropriate staffing to have at these locations upon full implementation. In other words, in the future, it may not be possible to make marginal adjustments to CDCR's budgets for minor swings in population unless there is an ability to close an entire yard or close an entire facility, because adding one inmate is not going to necessarily necessitate staff to activate a bed. But then likewise, reducing one inmate won't necessitate reducing a guard, because you need that guard there all the time. So that's one thing that we're currently looking at. CDCR should be commended for what they've done to date. It's been a lot of work to get to where we are. We're trying to get to a savings target of about $1.65 billion, and we hope by revise to be able to demonstrate to the legislature how we plan to achieve as much savings as possible. Now, will we get to the full 1.65? We're not 100% sure yet, but we're looking at it. And again, like I said, the reason we're not 100% sure yet is because we're running into some of this baseline staffing issue that we have to review. And that review is tedious. There's a lot of work that goes into it as you go yard by yard and facility by facility. But we are continuing with it. Our ultimate goal out of this is to ensure that we have, in the end, a safe and cost-effective prison system that generates the savings and demonstrates to everyone that we have an appropriate system based on who we have left. And some of this will include looking at the right capacity, and it will include an appropriate facility plan to ensure that you have the right mental health beds, to ensure you have the right medical beds, to ensure you just have the right beds for the levels that you have remaining. So those are things that we're currently looking at. However, if expenses do come to light that we don't think we can fund from within existing resources, as always, this, at least in the short term, there is a swing in population. So, for instance, if the population for some reason starts to decline slower and we don't end up getting to a base level of staffing, we may have to come back and look at, whether or not we have to augment based upon a higher population. I'll tell you right now, the adult population is actually trending lower than what we originally projected, while the parole population is actually trending slightly higher. So there may have to be some tweaks along the way as we continue to look at the ultimate end game on the savings plan.
Okay. Public comment. Yeah, do we have any general public comment on today?
Thank you. Gail Brown with Life Support Alliance. Life Support Alliance advocates for more of the term-to-lifer prisoners that are eligible to go home. It's a very expensive population, and less than 1% recidivism versus the 67% or whatever the state is claiming now. We're concerned, I'm certainly concerned on the agenda here that says major drivers of prison population growth, which doesn't even list the term-to-lifers as one of the reasons for population growth. Releasing more of them would help a huge cost savings, and I'm sorry to hear that there was really no discussion of that at all today. One of the concerns also that I have is with the budget cuts, where I don't know how many people in this room realize it, but back in the 70s and 80s, we actually had, for families that visit prisoners, 7 days a week of visiting, 12 hours a day. And since we've grown 500% in the population, we're now down to 2 days of visiting for a lot more people to come in and stay in contact. So as you lose contact with your family members that are inside, you're breaking up families. It's a public safety issue. I think this committee ought to look at that too. I know it's about budget, but if we're trying to keep people out, successfully out, and you keep them away from their families, I think that that's something that you need to look at. The budget cuts have cut down yard time. Guys and gals are stuck inside. They're not able to program. And I think that that's also part of this mix. And I know that other comments will be made. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi again, this is Karen from Legal Services for Prisoners with Children. I had two brief comments. One is on the fire camp issue. The fire camps are something that, as talking to people in the women's prisons, have been very popular and have certainly are a place where people are able to both contribute to society as well as learn a skill. One of the real problems with fire camp, both in terms of people are also not only learning how to fight fires, there are also a lot of EMT preparation that happens through the fire departments. And as long as people are not able to get their licensing at the end of their sentences, this is a huge gap between the skills that people are learning and then their ability to be able to provide for their families and have a job at the other end of their incarceration. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. The other thing is about out-of-state prisoners. And I understand that this is a question of numbers and that if you bring them back, then you have more numbers inside. I do think, however, that the cost around recidivism, the cost to families, because we deal a lot with prisoners and their families, it has been an enormous problem for family members and for the people inside the prisons when they're halfway across the country or all the way across the country. And the sooner that CDCR is able to bring people back, the better it's going to be for everyone. So I just also wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Vanessa Nelson, also with Life Support Alliance. As part of the packet distributed to you folks by CURB, we have a letter in there that details 4 specific actions that we think that could be taken by the legislature that would help. One of those, and perhaps the most important, being that either by legislative action or direction, you direct the parole board to take a better look at what they're doing. Right now, the parole rate for lifers is about 17%. Under the language of the law, which says the prisoners shall normally be found suitable for parole, that's usually taken to mean about 50%. So we're way beneath that standard right now. It's increasing, but it's not increasing at a fast enough rate. As mentioned, they recidivated about 1% or less than 1%. And they cost about $150,000 a year to incarcerate. I encourage you to take a look at this. There's another issue in there that there was a board created about 3 years ago called the Forensic Assessment Division that costs the state any place between $2.9 and $5 million a year to run that division. It does something that no other state does, which is psychologically evaluate every single life prisoner. It's a very controversial board, even among psychologists. I encourage you to take a look at that and see if we can't do something about that board. Thank you.
Hi, Emily with CURB. I just want to speak briefly about the out-of-state population and just really want to highlight that as we're thinking about how we meet the benchmarks around population reduction, that we don't create awful trends like sending people out of state, because now we're seeing with realignment shifts to try to move county prisoners out of state. So we need to think really hard about what we create to meet these population benchmarks, and that we don't have to that they don't turn into a landslide of problems for us down the road in terms of replicating them on the county level as we're just shifting overcrowding from the state prisons to the county jails, and really that we know there's a series of population reduction strategies that we could implement immediately to reduce overcrowding safely, again in the packet. So I think we could bring people home and we can meet the benchmarks. So please take all that into consideration. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Curtis Hill on behalf of the State Sheriff's Association. Make a couple of comments in regards to fire camps. We've had some great negotiation. Darby Kernan outlined the status of the fire camp discussion with you accurately. We're waiting for the last and final draft from the attorneys relative primarily to medical costs and transportation and the ability for individual counties to set up their contracts with CDCR and the back pages of the document. The one area that we do have a problem with, as representing the 58 sheriffs in California, is in the area of the $46.19 rate for sheriffs to pay the state for this population going back. We feel that it should be cost neutral. The only incentive that sheriffs see from a perspective of being 5 months into implementation right now, and where they're going through all the operational implementation components of this whole process, is that a fire camp inmate gets 2-for-1 credit. That's a tremendous advantage to cut those sentencing times for this population. However, with that said, the issue is surrounding, we feel that it should be cost neutral going back. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Pete Wywordy with the California Partnership and the Health and Human Services Network, and we consistently come up to the Capitol and talk about revenue and finding new ways to protect social service programs. We represent about 300 organizations across the state, anti-poverty organizations, clinics, food banks, etc. And we were here today with 200 folks who are fighting to protect the CalWorks program. And so just wanted to come here today and express that we see the prisons budget as a source of revenue. Saving money on prisons and bringing people home can bring money into other important social service programs. And so I'll echo all the folks will parade up here over the next several months in the budget battle that corrections, if we see corrections spending to go down, we can put that money into the important programs that keep folks safe and in their houses and across the state of California. So thank you.
Thank you.
Craig Brown for the California Correctional Peace Officers Association. On the issue of out-of-state beds, we think it's an important policy priority that in this master planning process, they make it a policy goal to get rid of the out-of-state beds. Those beds simply are taking California taxpayer dollars and supporting jobs in other states. We have plenty of people in the state who are capable of doing that work. We ought to keep our dollars home and employ Californians, not Arizonans and wherever the hell else these people are. On the issue of fire camps, the fire camps are absolutely the best program Corrections has. The criteria has been increased over time to put more risky inmates in. We think that evaluation, the analyst's suggestion, needs to be done very, very carefully. When I was at Youth Authority, we lost camps because one incident. You put one guy in and they go out and do one thing really stupid in the community, you lose the camp. So there's a huge risk when you play with that criteria. It just needs to be done very carefully. Finally, on the prison by prison, yard by yard staffing package, we think, again, that's an excellent effort. It needs to be completed very carefully. The one that we've seen so far did a very good job of cutting down the number of officers at the facility, well below the reduction anticipated with the inmate population based on prior levels of that same prison, but had more managers, more supervisors, and more medical personnel. We think the emphasis in those plans ought to be keeping people on the line who actually serve inmates, teachers, nurses, doctors, correctional officers, correctional counselors, and the plans need to be careful to take care of the reductions at the top at the same time they're taking care of the reductions at the bottom. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm John Lovell with the California Police Chiefs Association and the California Narcotic Officers Association. I hadn't intended to comment at all, except I did want to correct something that was presented to you in testimony. Mr. Fuhrer is exactly right. You need to have accurate data and information from which to make long-term decisions. And the assertion that Proposition 36 contributed to any decline in prison population is factually inaccurate. Proposition 36 dealt with treatment in lieu of criminal sanctions for possession offenses, not for sales offenses, not for possession for sales offenses. And in actual fact, and I can say this from 8 years as a prosecutor as well, that no one goes to state prison for simple possession of drugs. So to suggest that Prop 36 had anything to do with any decline is simply factually inaccurate.
Final word?
Okay, Carol Strickman. I'm also with Legal Services for Prisoners with Children. And I just want to say a word about, in terms of women's programs, about the mother-infant programs that we have in California. They've been pretty successful. I believe they're less expensive for each woman prisoner than the main prisons, and they help relieve some of the crowding. They're in some jeopardy right now. We're working with CDCR to try to keep them going, but I do think that we need to expand the eligibility, just like with the alternative custody program. It's the eligibility is too restrictive, and these programs do allow women to live with their children under age 6. Sometimes they come in pregnant and have their newborn with them, and it's a very good program. And like the fire camp, one of the best programs that CDCR has. We want to keep them going. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Fair, final words? No final words? Okay, that concludes today's hearing. We are anxiously awaiting the report, and we'll be following up on that. Thank you, everybody, for spending the afternoon with us.